Coming up, the Tories claim that the new law requiring voters to show official photo ID in order to vote is a measure to safeguard democracy. Except that isn't true. There were just four convictions for voter fraud in the last general election across the whole of the UK, making this new law unnecessary and proving that there is a hidden agenda for its introduction. Conservative ministers claim that voter fraud is a massive problem. It isn't. There are more Tory MPs currently defending allegations of sexual misconduct than there have ever been prosecutions for voter fraud in the history of the UK. And although some overseas viewers may be thinking, what's the big deal? Voter ID is required to vote in my country. In the UK, there are no government-issued ID cards as such. Sure, the new law allows driving licences and passports or one or two other less common documents to be used as ID in the polling booth, but many millions of voters don't carry such photo ID in their day-to-day lives, and there are 2 million voters who don't even possess a document that could be used as photo ID for voting. And surprise, surprise, this group of voters overwhelmingly vote against the Conservative Party. What we are looking at is a brazen measure taken by the government to steal the next general election. Stay tuned. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me out by hitting the like button and especially by sharing a link to this video on your social media platforms. Before I get into the facts about the voter suppression this government has enacted, please can I urge any UK voters watching this video to make sure you're registered to vote and that you have an acceptable form of photo ID, or you apply for a postal vote online. And in England, bear in mind that we have the local elections on the 4th of May this year, in which you'll not be allowed to vote without acceptable photo ID. So if you don't have a passport or a driving licence, visit the Electoral Commission website, where they list other acceptable forms of photo ID. Here's the link on the screen, and I'll add it to the comments below this video as well. If you don't have any of the documents on the list, you'll need to apply for a Voter Authority Certificate, a VAC, or a postal vote. Again, visit that same site for details of how to do this, and it's free. But I don't care if it's free or not, this new requirement is a solution to a non-existent problem, and is an obvious attempt by the government to constrict democracy and give themselves an advantage in future elections. Everyone outside of the Parliamentary Conservative Party will admit that voter fraud in the UK is a non-issue. The only purpose of the legislation is to stop certain progressive, left-leaning groups of voters from exercising their vote. And unfortunately, I have to report that it seems to be working. Only 1% of those 2 million people who don't have suitable ID have so far applied for it. 1%. If the government were truly interested in protecting democracy, this low take-up should alarm them. But what has been their response to date? Tory local government minister Lee Rowley has claimed that the reason only 1% of the voters affected by the legislation have actually applied for their voter authority certificate was because the other 99% were demonstrating their democratic right not to have to vote. Rowley would like us to believe that the scheme is going brilliantly, at the same time that only 505 people aged 75 plus have actually applied for the certificate across the entire country. The government's own estimates for the cost of the voter ID scheme is around £12 million a year. So, with a general election, say on average every 4 years, that means a cost to the public finances of £12 million per conviction for voter fraud. And clearly, 4 fraudulent votes in a general election, where there are 58 million votes cast, none of them came anywhere near to having the slightest effect on the outcome in any constituency. Voter fraud in the UK is for all practical purposes non-existent, as shown in this pie chart from the Electoral Reform Society website. And for the roughly 1 in a million votes that are fraudulent, it's a victimless and pointless crime that will never succeed. Ask yourself this question: would this government be prepared to spend £12 million on each individual case of rape, assault,
burglary or domestic violence where there is actually a victim and there is harm from the crime? Of course they wouldn't. Why not? Because it wouldn't help to suppress the anti-Tory vote. Look, I wanted to release this video today to highlight this brazen Tory voter suppression method, but also to warn my viewers to make sure that you're eligible to vote in the next election. I don't think the electorate as a whole have yet woken up to the fact that this draconian legislation is already in place and is about to have its first impact by obliging would-be voters to show photographic identification at polling stations in England on the 4th of May in the upcoming local elections. It's pretty obvious, given the 1% take-up of the VAC, the new Voter Authority Certificate, that this year's local elections in England will probably prove chaotic and will lead to many people being turned away who didn't even realise they had to bring ID with them. How many of those will be able to, or more importantly have the time, to return home, get their ID and then go back to the polling station? My answer to that would be mainly the retired, a group that skews pro-Tory in their voting habits. You can see that the government has really thought this through. They trialled this mandatory photo ID at the 2018 and 2019 English local elections, and participating councils required voters to bring a form of identification. And within just that small trial, over 1,000 would-be voters didn't return to vote after being refused a ballot for not having their voter ID with them. So it's obvious to even the most thickest, paranoid right-wing numpty that the scheme is going to disenfranchise far more genuine voters than suspected wrongdoers. And the fact that only 21,000 out of the 2 million potentially disenfranchised voters have actually applied for their VAC at the time of recording this, that's the 1% I mentioned earlier, this shows that the government's evil plan is so far working. It's just an appalling attack on electoral democracy. And just to give you further evidence that this new legislation has nothing to do with protecting democracy, as the Tories like to claim, the Tory-leaning pensioners are allowed to use their senior rel cards and the like as photo ID to vote, but for people under the age of 25 who overwhelmingly vote anything but Tory, the government has decided that student cards and young people's travel passes are not valid as photo ID. And bear in mind, this overwhelmingly anti-Tory group of voters are the least likely demographic to hold a driving licence or a passport. Nahal Bajwa from the National Union of Students has said the new rules threaten to disenfranchise millions of people, despite hardly any evidence of a need for such steps to be taken. She added, young people, including many students and apprentices, risk being excluded from voting almost entirely. It's quite horrifying. Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, has said that the voter ID scheme will lock people out of democracy, adding, this shocking data lifts the lid on the damaging impact the policy could have for marginalised voters. The Electoral Commission themselves, already stripped of many of their powers by this corrupt, populist hard-right government, have said that because of the ridiculously fast and underhanded implementation of the new legislation, the timetable has meant that the local elections in England this May could not be conducted in a fully secure, accessible and workable manner. And yet the Tories are sticking to the lie that the measure is all about protecting democracy. Now, I will just add that Northern Ireland already has a long-standing voter ID system. And that's understandable. It was introduced because there was genuine electoral abuse by sectarian groups going back many years. So there was a genuine need for voter ID. There was no suggestion it was done to suppress genuine voters, and it was rolled out in a timely manner with full information given to the electorate across Northern Ireland. Compare and contrast that set of circumstances with what's happening in the rest of the UK this year. There is no genuine need for legislative measures against fraudulent voting. The timetable has been rushed, and there has been no widespread information campaign alerting voters to the new requirements. And on top of all that, it is the governing party themselves who are set to gain by implementing these unnecessary restrictions to voting rights. At a time when the government is stripping away our rights to protest and our employment rights, our rights to free assembly and our rights to strike, our rights to rivers free of sewage, and post-Brexit freedom of movement across Europe. This is just the latest example of a government determined to suppress and whittle away our civil rights and freedoms. Thumbs up for the Liberal Democrats' reaction to this trashing of electoral democracy. Their local government spokesman, Helen Morgan, said, "The Conservative government has taken away people's unobstructed right to vote and now are refusing to cancel these plans before it's too late." Today, the local government minister, Lee Rowley, continues to evade and deny that there is even a problem. Voter ID regulations are nothing short of voter suppression. These unsavoury, Trumpian tactics have no place in British democracy. And for the Labour Party, Shadow Communities Minister Alex Norris called on the government to wake up and act to prevent these voter ID requirements from locking huge numbers of people out of their democracy at the next election. The Electoral Reform Society calls the legislation a barrier to democracy for some and claim that, unlike in mainland Europe where everyone has a mandatory national ID card, in the UK and USA, the richer you are, the more likely you are to have ID. Many citizens who can't afford to go on foreign holidays don't have passports, and those that can't drive don't have driving licenses. It's quite clear that the government is intending to disadvantage already marginalised groups who tend to skew against the Tory party in their votes. And this anti-democratic tactic may actually be enough to tilt marginal constituency votes back in the Tories' favour. Where is the outrage in the mainstream media?